Uh, Good evening, everyone. Very nice to see you all. Do I need to do some housekeeping and say if your mobile, you don't have to turn your mobile phone off. No, don't turn it off. Because if you do turn, if it rings while I'm talking, unless it's my mum, let's say you've got to buy a book, yeah? Is that it? Anyway, it's very nice to be here. By way of introduction, before I start, I'm actually going to read you a very quick couple of paragraphs, which I'd like you to all bear in mind throughout the evening. It's something I'd like you to think about while I'm talking to you. It's a quote from a book by a man called Christopher Booker, who wrote a study of why we tell each other stories. Why do we tell each other stories? And he wrote in his book that it is a curious characteristic of our modern civilization that whereas we are prepared to devote untold physical and mental resources to reaching out to the furthest recesses of the galaxy or delving into the mysteries of the atom in an attempt, as we like to think, to plumb every last secret of the universe, one of the greatest and most important mysteries is lying so close beneath our noses that we scarcely even recognize it to be a mystery at all. And he's considering why we tell each other stories. And he says, at any given moment, all over the world, hundreds of millions of people will be engaged in what is one of the most familiar forms of all human activity. In one way or another, they'll have their attention focused on one of those strange sequences of mental images which we call a story. Now, we spend a phenomenal amount of our lives following stories, telling them, listening to them, reading them, watching them being acted out on the TV or on film or on stage, and they are by far and away one of the most important features of our everyday existence. I'd like you to bear that in mind while I talk to you tonight. My name is Dan Carrier. I am a reporter at a newspaper called the Camden New Journal. I'm also a history graduate. Now, I feel is slightly esteemed company because the Camden History Society provides the CNJ. You're like our brethren. If you provide us with the bread and butter, so many brilliant books, so many good features, and so handy for research purposes. Now, I studied history at Sussex University under a professor called Alan Howkins. And I'm referencing him because he was a really big influence when I was a young man. I really enjoyed his lectures. His specialism was on English peasantry, the Enclosure Acts, so pre-modernisation, pre-industrial Britain. But every single tale, every single lecture he would tell me would link to something which was contemporary. He had this amazing ability to bring you from 300 or 400 years ago to the present day in one sentence. And I was always very inspired by him. Another person who, as a young man, I also really loved, when I was a baby, I used to be babysat by A.J.P. Taylor. And my mum and dad used to nudge me as a 5-year-old and say, you know, he's a famous history professor. I had no idea what a history professor was, but I decided I'd quite like to be one. So whenever anyone would ask me, what do you want to be when I was a little kid, instead of saying a fireman, a spaceman, I'd say a history professor. So I went off and studied history at Sussex, and had always wanted to be a writer and be a reporter. And I had worked at the Camden New Journal as a 13-year-old. I used to deliver it as a newspaper boy. I used to get a penny a copy, and if you see my wage slip nowadays, you'll realise how different my wages were. Not a great difference. So as someone who's trained as a historian and have always been interested in history, being a local newspaper reporter is akin to doing that. It's like being a social historian. Often my colleagues laugh at me when I say this because it's giving us cheap hacks sort of airs and braces. But in many ways, it's about telling people stories. It's about it's almost like being a transcriber for the mass observation unit. A voice for the voiceless. You take down people's histories, their stories that otherwise wouldn't be told. And I have this little dream that in 100 years' time, someone's going to come and see Tudor's, the next Tudor in 3 or 4 generations on, or the Malcolm with 3 or 4 generations on, and they want to know what Camden looked like in 2023. And so they'll go and pick up a copy of the Camden New Journal, and they'll see an obituary I wrote with a dustman who works in Camden Town, and it will hopefully give them a little snapshot of what it means to be alive today. I come in and use the archives here quite regularly, and I really do love the idea that the CNJ is about recording and about finding stories, about telling those stories, and about local history. I'll give you a very quick example. I could give you hundreds of these, but one which springs to mind now. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a woman in a cafe. She came up to me and said, "Oh, you work at the paper, don't you?" Yeah. And she told me a story about her father. Her father had moved to Kentish Town from Trinidad in 35, 36. So pre-Windrush, immigrant coming over from the Caribbean. He settles in London. He got a job at a Kodak factory and he'd become a photographer. After the war, he married an Irish lady, an Irish nurse who worked at the Whittington. So immediately the story has roots in our neighbourhood ground in second, third generation immigration, really interesting. An Irish nurse married a black photographer from the Caribbean, set up a family in Kentish Town. He became St Pancras Borough Council's go-to wedding photographer, and then Camden Council's go-to wedding photographer. So he would spend every Saturday on the steps of St Pancras Town Hall, taking everyone's photographs when they got married. Now, sadly, by the time he must have been about 75, but as an older man, he decided he wanted to move back to the Caribbean. And his daughter told me a rather sad story that it was partly because he still faced quite a lot of racism, essentially. Even as an old man who lived in London for 50 years, he still faced bigotry and racism. And eventually he'd had enough and said, right, I'm going to go back to Trinidad and live out my old age there. Problem was, he didn't know what to do with his archive. He had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shots of people on their happiest day of their lives, dating from actually pre-war, because he started as a photographer in about 37. They all got thrown on a skip. Yeah. Now I'm so pleased you go, oh, because that was but in 1980, he's got boxes and boxes of these slightly dog-eared, ramshackle pictures. He didn't know the historical value, so he threw them all away. So his daughter came to see me. Lovely photo album of photos he'd taken of the family. We put a call out in the CNJ. Says, does anyone have a photograph taken by a man called Fabian Bullin, number 5 Lawford Road, NW5, little stamp on the back. I have been inundated. Absolutely. Literally hundreds of photographs that Vanita's dad has taken. So I've been able to reunite them with his daughter. And now that's her kind of social history. It's not academically rigorous, but it's still, to me, that's the sort of social history I enjoy. And really, that is what my book's about. Now, one of my jobs at the New Journal, I literally have done every job there, from paperboy through to news editor, crime reporter, feature writer, film reviewer, book reviewer. I make a good cup of tea for my colleagues. I've done everything there. And one job I have is to write a diary page. Now, the Camden Journal comes out on a Wednesday night. Thursday morning, we're all looking pretty exhausted. We've been trying to fight the good fight for everyone. And Thursday morning's kind of downtime. We have a Westminster edition, which comes out on the Friday. So we spend Thursday pulling together the Westminster edition, changing some of the news pages, making it more Westminster centric. And there's a Westminster diary, a page called the diary now. Now, I've always enjoyed reading diaries, and I don't mean sort of Samuel Pepys diaries, I mean newspaper diaries, which are kind of conversational, they're quirky, they're all the sort of things reporters want to put in the paper, but the news editor won't let you. I'm going to just read you a little extract from one of my favourite diarists who inspired me while I was writing the Westminster Extra Diary. You know, a journalist called, well, his real name was Charles Nevin, but he wrote under the name Captain Moonlight, which I instantly liked. Who's this Captain Moonlight chap? And this is a cutting from the 80s that he produced, a column he produced. And it reads like this. It says, "Ahoy! It's good to have you on board. Now, I'd like to start this week by talking about us. You will have seen that the government has just published its annual set of statistics about the nation. And as part of the Moonlight Monitoring Service, we never blink, I've been delving deep, very deep indeed. So are you ready? On page 36, table 1.14, interregional migration within the United Kingdom, I discovered that by reading down the table, that 16,000 people had migrated from Yorkshire and the Humber to the northwest, while 16,000 people had migrated from the northwest to Yorkshire and Humber. What can be going on? Is this some quaint northern custom? Are they the same people? Has the BBC started a programme called Changing Regional Areas? Number two, it takes Britain on the average hourly earnings for all industries and services, 1 hour and 1 minute to earn enough to buy 1 kilogram of frozen cod fillets. And number three, 11% of all the people who did not report a crime dealt with it themselves. And number four, the number of men dressmaking or doing needlework or knitting has risen from 2% of the population to 3% since 1977. And finally, according to my calculations, based on table 13.13, participation in selected leisure activities away from home by age shows that nearly 300,000 people aged 60 or over had visited a nightclub or disco in the last 3 months. Well done. So that's the sort of thing a diary page to me should be. It should be conversationalist, it should be fun. I used to spend a lot of time using it as an excuse to interview quirky characters, to write previews of films or shows I wanted to blag free tickets to, writing reviews of things. Now, cast your mind back to January 2020. Do you remember on the 10 o'clock news, probably about 10:26, there was a 30-second news item about a virus that people in a place called Wuhan in China had contracted? Absolutely, I mean, barely registering on British media yet. Something was happening, very long way away. None of us felt particularly threatened by it. In fact, it seemed a bit of a space filler on the news at 10. Come February, it's creeping a bit closer, wasn't it? And then it reached Italy. I remember reading, by then it had hit the front pages, this is mid-February, in northern Italy, cases of something called the coronavirus. None of us had heard of it before, thought about it before, had hit so many people in northern Italy that they were going to go into something called lockdown. Again, not a phrase that any of us really knew about or understood back then. It still didn't seem real, even though it had reached Europe. And my editor, about 6 weeks before it reached our shores, called us all into a meeting. Now, our editor was a chap called Eric Gordon. He was in his late 80s then, brilliant bloke, a real mentor to myself and my colleagues. And he sat us all down, and we thought it was very rare of him. He'd probably call a meeting with all the staff once a year, and it would be to berate us and to remind us about the newspaper and, you know, what we were doing, what we held in our hands and how we had to protect the newspaper's values. So it's quite rare for him to bring us all into one place. And he sat us down and he said, I think we're going to be locked down in London. I think this virus is coming and I think it's bad news. And I'd been reading, you know, I read the papers every day. I've listened to Radio 4. I kind of felt like I was clued up. I didn't have that reaction at all. He said, well, how are we going to deal with this? And I thought he meant, how are we going to report about it? He didn't. He said, how are you actually going to produce a newspaper? Because you're not going to be able to come into our office. So how do you physically work in a team of 20 people if you can't be all in the same room? Have any of you thought about that? So we had this kind of, he was like a canary in the mine. So when we reached March 2020, do you remember there was the week where the then Prime Minister's father said, I'm going to go to the pub and no one can stop me? You see where his son gets it from, don't you? Do you remember that week? Okay, so that week, suddenly COVID was here. It was very real. We had reported on the first death in Camden, a horrendous tragedy. A 31-year-old boy, bus driver, lived in St Albans Road up in Highgate, sort of Kentish Town, near Parliament Hill Fields area, I should say. And suddenly it was real, and we were all working from home. We were trying to put a newspaper together that wasn't sensationalist in any way, shape or form, that was informative, that dealt with really something which was quite unprecedented. I mean, it felt to me that I felt in a way, I could imagine how local reporters would have felt when the Second World War broke out, with something which was so alien to us and affected every single person in our society. So I've spent this week trying to find out as much as we can, trying to ensure that we write in a calm and clear way. Our newspaper had, every Christmas we run a special, it's like a hamper fund. We make sure vulnerable people in our communities have everything they need, make sure our readers are able to look after them. So we have really good contacts within our communities. And that week, my phone has started ringing and it hadn't stopped. And it was from people who weren't quite sure where to turn to. Older people perhaps who said, you know, I can't get any food delivered, I've got nothing left in the fridge, can't get through to Camden Council, or if I can get through to Camden Council, I have to please press number 9 and wait. So what do? They ring up the local paper. Local paper is often like the fourth emergency service. We get an awful lot of calls fielded to us, which won't be things about stories, but will be about people who are after information. So I spent this week covering COVID and receiving calls from vulnerable people. I'd also received calls from a variety of businesses, catering businesses, restaurants, cafes, all the hotels in the West End, saying, well, we've got to close, but we've got kitchens full of food. What do we do? One of my favourites, a pub called The Pineapple, rang me up and said, we've got to close. No one told us. I've just got 600 pints of fresh ale. They need to be drunk in a week. Can you help? Anyway, so come Thursday, I've spent the week covering this story and also organising emergency food packages to people who were in need, which actually developed over the pandemic into a food bank. But come Thursday morning, I think, well, I've got to write this Westminster Extra Diary. I've completely not thought about it all week. What am I going to write about? Everything's closed. I can't write a preview of a concert I wanted to go to because nothing's on. I haven't interviewed anyone with a particularly quirky and funny story. To be honest, I wasn't in the mood. The world outside my front doorstep was too grim. So I started thinking to myself, what does London mean to me? I've been out and about while everyone else has been locked down because we're qualified as key workers, and I'd actually borrowed a van off a van hire company in Kentish Town. They owed the newspaper a favour because the owner had done a marathon, and we put him in the paper to say congratulations. So I knew I could go and borrow a van off him. So I borrowed this van. And I was driving around the streets of central London, going into hotels, emptying all of their frozen bacon, taking it to community centres, distributing all this grub. And whilst I was doing that, I felt nostalgic for London. Whilst the buildings were there, you lot weren't. The people who made the city weren't there. And suddenly you could take your time as well because the streets were empty. There was no hurrying and scurrying. I could see the buildings. I could see the pavements. And the only thing was missing was the people. So that Thursday morning, I thought, right, I'm going to write a love letter to London. I thought it would only last a week. I thought I'd write for things I'm going to miss. What would I like to be doing in London if there wasn't this horrendous pandemic? Now, I booked some tickets that week to go to the Wallace collection. Now, when you think of the Wallace collection, I always think of, I hope you do too, I suppose, classical statues, horrendously over-the-top golden gilt clocks, a few old masters, right? Well, the reason I was going to the Wallace collection was the archivist had told me they'd got 800 objects with pictures of dogs on. And I thought that was lovely. So I thought I was going to do that. So I wrote my first column, which eventually became 154 weeks of walking through central London about the Wallace collection. And I carried on. I traced my route. I went on a bicycle. I started at the Wallace collection, and every week I would carry my way on a map, work out where I was going next, and start researching the buildings. Now, the buildings and the people behind them, I should say. It's a form of detective work. I mean, being a historian is a form of, it is like being a detective. It's uncovering stories and then using them to extrapolate, to put their things into context. And so that is what I was doing. And I'd like to tell you a bit about the sources I used and then show you some examples. Now, obviously, there's great resources like the Holborn Local Studies Archive. Online, we're really fortunate now that so many collections are being digitalised. I used a website called britishhistory.ac, which you will know of. It's so brilliant. It's absolutely packed with street by street. It's almost like a Pevsner, but expanded. Street by street details, names of people who've lived in the buildings, which you can then use to do further research. I looked at things like the Old Bailey's proceedings. I would find the street I was in, and then I would cross-reference it to the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey now has all of its court cases from 1647 online. It's over 200,000 court cases. So that was really, really helpful. And I will give you a couple of examples of some of the court reporting I found. Now, I'd been going on my journey. I'd reached where were we? Wardour Street. Now, a little aside, when I walk around the streets of Camden today, I always take photographs. Can't stop taking photographs of architectural quirks. And one of the current architectural quirks I'm trying to capture are petrol stations, because they're disappearing at a huge rate. I mean, the petrol stations, because we're coming to the end of the petrol age, petrol stations are closing down left, right, and centre. And in 30 years' time, my grimy photograph of an old Esso or Shell at the end of the street will look beautiful and quirky. Now, as I'm walking down Wardour Street, I'm thinking that there was a set of stables around the back and associated sort of horse industries. There were 3 million working horses in London just at the end of the Second World War. So it's only within a generation we've lost them, yeah? So anyway, coming down Wardour Street, I'd found this crime story about a Wardour Street chemist called Cecil Bishop, who was an absolutely mad horse lover. But he got tangled up with a gambler called Daniel Dawson. Now, Dawson met Bishop at his Soho chemists, and he spoke of a friend's ride who'd been given a tonic that made the nag's feet swell. And it meant a bailiff who had come to collect this horse in lieu of unpaid debts couldn't ride this horse, poor creature, away. Now, the tincture wore off really quickly, but it was a good way of keeping your horse out of the hands of the bailiffs. Now, this Mr. Daniel Dawson thought, hang on a minute, give me some of that tincture, let's go around the races and knob all the favourites. So Dawson met Bishop, and after making up his mixture, Dawson then returned and said it hadn't been strong enough. And instead, this poor naive Bishop chap gave Dawson a phial of arsenic. And suggested that he dash it in the water trough of the horse he had hoped to knob. Yeah. Now, he tested it on Lord Darlington's horse called Reuben at the Brighton races in 1808. And then he tried his luck at Newmarket. Again, he got the dosage wrong, and he was caught following the death of 6 racers. So I found that story by walking down Wardour Street, looking at what businesses had been there, knowing that an apothecary chemist had been there, and then cross-referencing it with Old Bailey crime cases, which is a lovely way to find out quite new stories of our neighbourhood. I'd like to tell you a little bit about a place called the Lefebvre Gallery, because this was the scene of another crime I discovered, which has a lovely Camden link. The Lefebvre Gallery is in Mayfair. It's on a place called Bruton Street. And it is from from these Bruton Street premises, a painting by Picasso called Tête de Femme. You have to excuse my terrible French pronunciation. I'm going to say it like a Cockney. It was pinched in 1997 and led the famous cat burglar Peter Scott to have his day in the Snaresbrook Crown Court. Now, a quick aside. There was Camden Council set up a Camden in Bloom competition many years ago, and there was a church in King's Cross that always used to do really, really well. And there was a lovely old bloke who was the volunteer there and would look after all the flowers and do all the flower beds and keep things spick and span. Now, normally you win Camden in Bloom, and the green-fingered chap is more than happy to have his photo taken by a young reporter in the Camden New Journal. It's a nice celebration. This caretaker would make himself very, very absent whenever we wanted to come down and take a photograph. Just take a photograph of the flowers. You don't need to speak to me. We'll see why. Okay, so Scott's career was impressive. He was known for his athletic daring and his love of pilfering the jewellery boxes of the wealthy. He once stole a £200,000 necklace from Sophia Loren as she worked on the Peter Sellers film, The Millionairess. Lauren Bacall and the Shah of Iran were also victims, and he would say he stole from the real meaty jugular vein of society. But he also sometimes came away empty-handed. After raiding the homes of Beck Davis, Elizabeth Taylor and Shirley Bassey, he complained they didn't own anything worth stealing. Now, he'd been straight for some years when his collar was felt for the Picasso heist, having worked as a gardener at a King's Cross church. At his trial, he claimed he was just a go-between for the real culprits and the buyer before changing his plea after he was caught by the police in a sting operation with a carrier bag full of cash and the picture himself. I should have been, I think I've got a photograph of it here. Let's, maybe not, sorry. I can hold it up. No, well, actually, by the book, you'll see the picture of the lovely Picasso. A little aside, this Picasso, there's so many that the author, that the painter did with the same name. Over 350 paintings with the same name. I had no idea which one was the one which had been stolen, and nor did I know who I should approach for the rights to reproduce it in my book. My publisher was getting annoyed with me, deadline was coming, so I just basically bashed one out myself. If you look at the top, you can see that's done on a reporter's notebook. You can see the rings. So it's after Picasso rather than being Picasso. Now, on my journey, whilst I was looking at crimes, I obviously had to stop by Baker Street, home to Sherlock Holmes. Now, Conan Doyle used to get letters on a regular basis because his readership didn't realise that Holmes wasn't a real person. They actually, people would write and say, "Oh, Sherlock, my wife's ran away with so-and-so, can you find them?" Or, he'd get all these fan letters. So I paused outside 221B, fictional home of Sherlock Holmes, and I found this rather lovely story about Conan Doyle, which I'd like to share with you. Now, Doyle was partial to a bit of sleuthing himself. And as I say, as Holmes' fame grew, Doyle found himself, he was asked to consider interesting cases. And sometimes, if his interest was piqued, he'd put on his famous deer stalker, well, you'd like to think he would, and get involved. And when he suspected someone had been caught like with a really heavy blow of injustice, he would throw himself in. And I found this one case that Conan Doyle investigated. He got a letter in the Morning Post about the tale of a mutilated pit pony, which was found in a field in the Midlands, in a mining village in 1903. And it was the latest of a spate of really quite nasty happenings going back a good few years that had baffled and appalled the rustic country folk of thereabouts and had led to really quite sour vibes and terrible innuendo in the tight-knit community there. Now, the village police, acting under increasing pressure and fear of ridicule when off duty in the local pubs, eventually pointed the finger at a chap called George Idalgi, who was an Anglo-Indian, and he was considered to be something of an outsider. You can imagine a bloke of Indian heritage living in a small Derbyshire mining village at the turn of the 20th century, I should say. He was considered a bit of an outsider. So the officers charged with bringing this murky tale to a conclusion, and egged on by the community, decided that George was a little bit odd and was probably guilty of stomping across muddy fields at night, armed with sharp tools. When they went round his house, they also found what looked like blood and horsehair on a coat and some muddy boots, so they banged him up. Now, after Doyle read about the case, he was convinced that poor George was innocent and threw himself into proving so. And the way this came about is just pure Holmes. He arranged to meet George, and as he approached, he saw that the young man was reading a newspaper and struggling to do so, as he was staring at the newsprint through extremely thick glasses. And it was clear he was partially blind, which makes the idea that he could have snuck into a field in the middle of the night, overpowered a large animal, and made extremely precise and deadly incisions impossible. Doyle investigated further, and he eventually found the real culprit, who was a man, love this name, man called Rodney Sharp. Doesn't he sound like a wrong one? Rodney Sharp. Rodney Sharp, who had worked in a butcher's shop and also on a cattle boat, and had a long-standing grudge against George and his family. And Doyle's investigations caused a public outcry, national outcry, and poor old George was released after doing 3 years of porridge. So I got these by cross-referencing the Old Bailey with the streets I was walking down, I found some really quite forgotten stories, the forgotten stories of Londoners. Another element, another really great resource for me was obviously newspaper archives. Now, I love a back edition of a newspaper. There's nothing better than reading a penny dreadful. Reading what my predecessors wrote about the Camden Journal in the 1800s never ceases to make me smile, laugh, and actually really it is quite tragic too. I mean, we've got St Pancras Chronicle here, lots and lots of letters there. So I looked through lots of reams of newspapers, and I found some quite lovely little examples of reportage. I was going down the Haymarket, heading down the slope past the famous Haymarket Theatre, and I came across a rather lovely, let me just find the right page, I do beg your pardon, a rather lovely story about a change in the law. Now, here we are. Okay. Now, as we go down the Haymarket, we're going to stop at a spot where in 1838, the Home Secretary, Lord John Russell, and some friends exited the theatre at the bottom, the Haymarket Theatre, on a very cold night. Now, a gang of urchins had created an icy slide for their amusement down the Haymarket slope. And while waiting for the knobs inside the heated theatres to head home so they could catch some pennies of them, they'd been skidding and tobogganing down this slope. Now, the unfortunate lord was knocked over by one of these excitable tobogganists. And I found, and I'm not sure whether this is coincidentally or maybe not, later that year, about 3 months later, after the Times had reported that the Home Secretary, Lord John Russell, had been sent flying by a little chap skidding down the road, later that year, Section 54 of the Metropolitan Police Act, which has never been repealed, came into force. The Metropolitan Police Act, Section 54, decrees that one must not slide on ice in any street or thoroughfare to the common danger of passengers. And, you know, did Lord John Russell get so grumpy about his top hat going flying that he introduced this bill just 3 months later? So that's something I found in newspapers. Actually, whilst I'm in the subject of the Haymarket, I also found this lovely quote from Dostoevsky, who wrote of Haymarket's nightlife. He wrote, "The streets are lit by jets of gas, something completely unknown in our own country. At every step you come across magnificent public houses, all mirrors and gilt." And the writer was also bowled over by the crowds, and he seems to have had what I would call a set of beer goggles on, because he also wrote, "You find beautiful women at the sight of whom you will stop in amazement. There are no women in the world as beautiful as the English. I went into a casino. The music was blaring, the people were dancing, a huge crowd was milling around, and the place was magnificently decorated. But gloom never forsakes the English, even in the midst of gaiety. Even when they dance, they look serious, if not sullen, making hardly any steps, and only doing so as if in an execution of some duty." Now, if any of you lot have seen me dance, you'll know that's absolutely true. So I found stuff in newspapers. I'd like to just actually refer to another story I found in the Times. At this point in my journey, I came across the old Middlesex Hospital. You know, Fitzrovia, where the famous Charles Dickens workhouse is, which is the last standing. They're trying to knock it down at the moment. The developers signed a Section 106 agreement when UCH sold off the Middlesex Hospital, that they would keep the workhouse as it was in a chapel. They've made their money. They've built this monstrosity where the old Middlesex used to be, and now they're not restoring the workhouse. I mean, this is why I work for a local paper. Things like that totally drive me mad. Anyway, I've gone past the Middlesex Hospital, and the Middlesex actually played a really important role in trying to save Londoners during the 1918 flu pandemic. In one October weekend, 60 people collapsed in nearby streets and were rushed there by ambulance. The hospital's chief medical officer at the time was quoted as complaining that he was merely directing the traffic, sending victims to the emergency wards, which was the 1918 version of an intensive care unit, or the mortuary.
And he said that writing BID, which stands for brought in dead, became a horribly routine entry in his notes. Now, how to tackle the flu became, as today with the pandemic, the stuff of claim and counterclaim. The Times, which said the visits of raiding Goths to London were but a summer shower compared to the deluge of germs we've just received, was not slow to offer possible remedies. Its health reporter suggested wearing a piece of cut gauze over the mouth and nose. We all know that one. Such good advice was offset also by his claim that smoking would see off the deadly virus, and which actually proved to be a really popular piece of advice, because across the country, it meant shop floors had to drop their no smoking rule. So the workmen really quite liked that bit of advice. He also added that drinking port and burgundy offered relief and protection too. So there you go. So things don't change. Hey? We have health reporters telling us how to protect ourselves and coming up with some great stuff, also talking a fair amount of nonsense. I used some of the archives of the Great Old London papers were really helpful. Now, we barely have a London paper, I'm afraid. The Evening Standard, and I worked there for a while, so I feel okay to say this, is basically a rag for commuters from Surrey. It doesn't really cover London news anymore. Local papers have been decimated. The New Journal is, we see it in our industry. We're just about the last one standing. I found a lovely story from the News Chronicle about Nye Bevan, the Labour legend. Now, I was going down Pall Mall, where obviously there's loads of clubs, the White's Club, St James's, places like that. And I found this lovely story about Nye. Now, he'd been invited to dinner at St James's, sorry, the White's Club, I should say, which used to be the unofficial headquarters of the Tory party. It's where Prince Charles had his stag do the night before he married Lady Di. Anyway, he'd been invited to this very posh club by the Marshal of the Royal Air Force, a bloke called Sir John Slessor. And this was 1951, and Bevan had worked really closely with him during the war, been in government with him, and they got along very well. Now, as I'm sure you know, Bevan had previously really quite riled Tories in a speech, which is often misquoted, but he said, "No amount of cajolery can eradicate from my heart a deep burning hatred for the Tory party that inflicted bitter experiences on me." And he was talking about the poverty in the 30s and the lack of response. But he also said, "As far as I'm concerned, they are lower than vermin," which is a very memorable quote, often taken out of context. Now, the Standard's Londoners Diary editor, Tudor Jenkins, recalled in this column that there were very few men who were so disliked as much at the time by the sons of the rich. Bevan was a real hate figure. And the news of his visit to this club, White's, quickly spread to neighbouring clubs. And a chap called Mr. John Fox Strangeways, lovely name, was supping champagne at Brooks directly opposite. And he decided to march over and actually land a haymaker on the politician. Bevan, Sir John told me, acted with great restraint, recalled Jenkins. And Sir John was actually less easygoing. He laid a complaint against poor old Fox Strangeways, who was also a member of White's, and he was forced to resign, and he got 3 months bird for his time. Now, again, I cross-referenced that from the Standard and the News Chron and the Old Bailey. He actually was taken to Central Criminal Court trying to beat up Bevan. Bevan apparently just took it on the chin. There you go. Now, other elements as I was walking around London, I was looking for, entertainment, theatre, cinema. We're so fortunate to live in a place where there's, on every street corner, there's some form of entertainment going on. I looked at old theatre posters to find stories that way, old bills. And by the time I'd reached Victoria, I thought I'd tell a story about the Victoria Palace Theatre, because I found a section of a series of adverts showing really some very strangely titled plays. It piqued my interest. Now, do you know the Victoria Palace Theatre? It's directly opposite Victoria Station. Before it was built, love this, before it was built, there was London's first multi-story horse wash there. So what you do is you clip-clop your horse onto the ground floor, load of people, you stay on your horse, load of people would cover you in soap with brushes, you go up a little slope onto the next floor, they throw buckets of water over you and your horse, onto the next floor. They rub you down and brush the horse down, and then you go down a slope in the opposite direction, which would take you back into Victoria Street. Isn't that lovely? There's no photographs of it because it was knocked down in 1835, but there's some etchings. Lovely. Anyway, so the world's first and probably only horse wash was on this site of the the Victoria Palace. Now, the first theatre there was the Royal Standard, and it was home to music halls. It was then replaced by a 1911 design by the architect Frank Matcham, and it was a groundbreaking design. Matcham included a sliding roof on the auditorium, which could be rolled back at intervals to let in fresh air, but also to offer the audience a view of the night sky. You can imagine no light pollution back then. You could sit back 15 minutes while your partner had gone to get you an ice cream and look at the sky above Victoria. Now, there was an impresario and a horse racing dabbler who also happened to be a baronet and a Tory MP called Alfred Butt, and he managed the programme there. I mean, how he had time to sit in the Commons, who knows? But now, because it had a reputation due to its musical past, people expected there to be light-hearted shows there. And even when serious plays were produced, the audience would look for laughs. In 1934, the 83-year-old Reverend Walter Reynolds wrote a play called Young England, which was a piece of really stodgy patriotism, and it was about how the Boy Scout movement instilled moral values. It was universally panned, but to such a degree that it became a massive cult hit. And at that theatre, they had 278 sold-out performances before it transferred to other West End theatres. Lines such as the Scout mistress saying, "I must go and attend to my girl's water," was roared out by a chorus of voices from the stalls, the owners of which had learned the awful script off by heart. Now, footnote to this is two years after this unintentional success, Butt, who represented Balham and Tooting from 1922, was accused and then found guilty of leaking the details of the 1936 budget and benefiting from that information financially. He didn't get nicked, but he resigned and he scurried off to Newmarket to spend the rest of his days looking after his horses. Now, I've got one more theatre story I'd like to share with you because it's another one which made me laugh so much. This was when I'd travelled a little bit further to the west of London, towards the Paddington area. Honestly, Shanks Pony, I did so much walking, soaking up so much from our streets. Now, I got to Montague Square. Montague Square was where, well, there's lots of famous people who lived there. There was Anthony Trollope had a house there. Anthony Trollope, Ted Hughes, the poet, and also Ringo Starr. Ringo Starr lived at number 13, and Jimi Hendrix, he bought it off Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix lived there first. But one of the reasons it has a little bit of cachet in the sort of Beatles history is it was where John and Yoko used it as a clandestine base to get together. When they first started dating each other, they would escape the press by hiding around Ringo's house. I quite like the idea that Ringo, being the least attractive of the Beatles, attracted the less press reporters, so they could get away with hanging around Ringo's. But a less well-remembered, but I think equally fascinating resident of Montague Square was an absolutely stinking rich amateur actor called Robert Romeo Coates. Now, he lived at number 28, and Coates won great fame basically for his own confidence and his thespian abilities. He used to go around proclaiming he was the best actor in Britain, and he loved playing Romeo. But his unique talents, I think is the way to describe him, meant he struggled to pass any auditions. But no matter, it didn't matter, because instead he poured his personal fortune into producing plays with himself cast in the lead role. He sounds an absolutely unmitigated hoot. He would continuously forget his lines, so he'd fill up Shakespeare with made-up dialogue instead. He absolutely loved doing a dramatic death, which meant he would repeat these moments 3 times in one performance. His reputation meant he completely sold out theatres because audiences wanted to see if he was as bad as was claimed. Now, Coates believed he could improve Shakespeare, and in one performance, he actually used a crowbar to pry open Capulet's tomb, and so he changed the ending of Romeo and Juliet. One poor lead playing opposite him was so embarrassed that she had to be carried off, while the Times reported that theatre goers at one performance in Richmond needed medical treatment after laughing so much. Now, it didn't help that he insisted on designing his own eccentric costumes, appearing in diamond-studded pantaloons that once split open to reveal more than you'd like on stage. Many believe Coates couldn't possibly be so blind to his own failings and was actually parodying the very serious world of George and Shakespeare productions. Sadly, the theatre was in a way the death of him, because he was the victim of a hit-and-run accident as he left the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, and he died soon after, age 76, at his Montague Place home. But I think you'll agree, a life very well lived, bringing much joy to others. Okay, I would like to tell you also about, well, really, I've mentioned some of the archives I'd used. I was very fortunate I had a library full of books, many of them Camden History Society publications, may I hasten to add. If you just look along this shelf here, I mean, we're so fortunate we live in a city that is so well covered by great writers. And I found a lot of inspiration from reading people like Patrick Hamilton, 20,000 Streets Under the Sky, and obviously his classic Hangover Square, absolute heartbreaker. H.V. Morton, who wrote London, not London Open House, that's the Geoffrey Fletcher one, sorry, Travels Through London. Norman Lewis, who lived around the corner actually in Holborn. His dad was one of the first sellers of photography equipment. He had a shop on High Holborn, another real favourite of mine. But these are all authors that are available on the shelves. At the Journal, we're really fortunate that we get sent quite a lot of unpublished memoirs. And there was one memoir I got sent, which I've drawn on in this book because it made me laugh so much. And it was the memoir of, let me just find the correct page, a chap called George Fage. I bet you've got it here. Yeah, Malcolm's nodding. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And let me just explain to you who he was. Okay, so I was, at this point, we've reached Soho. Yeah, I'm in Soho. And as we stroll along, let's briefly imagine ourselves here on a day in 1950 and gaze upon the sight of a young man accompanied by a monkey. The person in question is George Fage Sr., the well-known West End fruit and veg seller, and he has just bought this hairy chap from a sailor in a pub in Covent Garden. He's walking the creature down Greek Street, showing it off as he makes his way to his home across the Euston Road. Named Sinbad, the monkey lived in the Fages' attic above their greengrocer's shop at the bottom of Albany Street. Now, Lulu, Fage's wife, hated this beast, and the beast hated her. He'd been taught some rather rude gestures by the old man, which George Jr. recalls in his autobiography. My old man was a barrow boy, and Gran was a Piccadilly flower girl. And he always did this rude gesture towards Lulu, which made the old man roar with laughter, he adds. Now, after a year, the creature had grown to such an enormous size, they gave him to London Zoo, where he lived happily ever after. Now, the Fages were really well known in Soho, and as this book, which, as I say, was self-published, if at all, I'm not sure, I've got the manuscript, but Malcolm seems to know it. So, was it Paul Self? Yeah.
I seem to remember.
Yeah. Yeah. So George's gran was called Eliza, and she sold flowers to George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw would buy a bouquet off her every morning. So I wonder who he might have inspired. She might have inspired. She was the inspiration for Eliza Doolittle, basically. And George Fage Sr. was also a trove of London songs. Now, I do love a London song. I love a bit of musical, etc. And his son recalls the party pieces he would launch into, which includes the following. Shall I sing you this? I think I shall. My sister sells kisses to sailors. My mother makes gin in the bath. The old man makes counterfeit Tintin, and that's how the money rolls in. My brother's a slum missionary. He saves fallen women from sin. He'll save you a blonde for a shilling, because that's how the money rolls in. So there you go. Those are some of the thank you. Those are some of the books I've drawn inspiration for. Now I think I've got time for one more little tale. Whilst I was over, I'd headed towards the Edgware Road area, Paddington, and whilst I was up there, it struck me that Edgware Road, when I was a kid, was the go-to place to buy stereos, electrical equipment. And it set me off thinking, do you know Queen's Crescent in Kentish Town? Queen's Crescent used to have, and there's another really great book about this, which I think is one of your publications. It used to have 15 butchers in one stretch. And the reason for that was there was a big Anglo-Irish butchering community, and that was an area where lots of Irish people had settled, and they could walk from there over to Market Road in Islington, where they would work in abattoirs, and they would bring their meat back and sell it off stalls in Queen's Crescent, which was obviously a street market, which then led to them with refrigeration coming in, setting up butchers there. Same obviously for like Petticoat Lane, that's obvious. Leather Lane as well, Leather Lane outside the city walls, so you could have fields where you could make smelly stuff like leather, hence Leather Lane. So the Edgware Road had always had, as a child for me, and this is obviously only a generation ago, it was the sort of place where you could literally pick up any piece of electrical equipment you wanted. And I wondered why. And this is what I discovered, right? Just around the corner from Church Street, it was once the haunt of real radio hams and hi-fi gigs. And it was home to such celebrated stores as places like Henry's Audios, Lee's Electronics, something called Electrotech, and the famous H.L. Smith's, which had towering, tottering shelves packed with dusty old valve amps. Now, Henry's was the place for me. It was an Aladdin's cave of components that I absolutely never knew I needed, but as soon as I saw them, realised I had to have it. It began life in 48. And as well as hi-fi parts and speaker cones and woofers and tweeters and amps and valves and miles of cabling and disco lights and CB radio consoles, you'd also find those little everyday things that before the dominance of online retail was completely heaven sent to be picked up in a high shop. One reviewer of Henry's remembered how he'd found an exact replacement intercom box for a block of flats built in 1928, amongst their shelves, which is a lovely idea, isn't it? Now, the shop called Lee was mainly aimed at the radio, and it shifted portable personal radios. Now, remember, these are pre-mobile phone days, and that was when the airwaves was inhabited by those who enjoyed building radios and gassing away to people at the other side of the world, radio hams, and also used by mini cabs and vets. Vets used to use them. There you go. Sadly, most of these shops have gone. In fact, almost all of these shops have gone. And the reasons behind their demise are really interesting. It's not just because of the internet. Much of the supplies at places like Henry's came originally from surplus government stock. So in the same way army surplus clothing stores such as Lawrence Corner in Euston were trading gear made during the Second World War and the Cold War, electronic stores did a really good trade, taking on both Ministry of Defence cast-offs, manufacturing surpluses and defunct projects. And Edgware Road was perfectly placed for these. Now, light industries in London, there was aircraft component factories just a block away behind the shops in Edgware Road, where they made all of the radios which were fitted in Spitfires and Hurricanes. So they used to have so much surplus stuff, the blokes working there would either go and sell it off, take Nick's stuff and take it out, or they'd be defunct and it would be sold above board. But also, when they got home, they would take their know-how, how they built these intercom systems and radio systems, and build their kids' crystal radio sets, build them old valve amps. And so around the Edgware Road, this small cottage industry, which, 40 years, 50 years after the Second World War, I was benefiting from as a teenager. I was going buying hi-fis from the sons of the people who'd worked on the Spitfires. And I suppose in a way that kind of sums up what I was trying to do with this book. I was trying to find the hidden stories, the reasons behind why the city looks the way it does today. So I would also, I think maybe the last tale I'll tell is the way I use street maps. Now, obviously, you know about the Henry Booth maps. People like Mayhew would give you ideas of where the working class and where the poor lived in our cities. But I made quite a lot of use of bomb maps, the LCC maps of where the Blitz hit. And I was in central London and I was looking for a place called the Garlands. And I discovered that it had been long demolished by the Luftwaffe. Now, let me just tell you the story behind the Garlands Hotel, because again, it was a way of using a map in front of my eyes to to see how the city had changed. Okay, now it's just off Pall Mall, and it was in a street called Suffolk Street. It was built in 1840. And it's the famous Garlands Hotel. Now, it had a really classy reputation. It was a place that didn't need to advertise its existence, but if you knew, you knew. And among those who certainly did know was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and the brilliantly titled Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. I wish that was more famous than Uncle Tom. It's such a great name for the title. I was on the guest list where D.H. Lawrence stayed there quite a lot, James Whistler and Henry James. Now, one wonders if James and Anthony Trollope, who was also a regular, ever met at the Garlands bar, and if so, what the atmosphere may have been like between these two giants of Victorian literature. James had recently poured vitriol on Trollope's work, calling, for example, the Belton Estate novel in the series of his Barchester novels a stupid book without a single thought or idea in it, a sort of mental pabulum. And he also questions Trollope's habits of wandering off on a tangent, as was the vogue of all the great novelists of the time. I think of those meandering passages in Victor Hugo. You can see what a trend it was. Now, Trollope finished his earthly journey in the drawing room of Garland's, and it was said that he was laughing so much at his family giving a reading of a comic novel called Vice Versa that he had a fatal seizure. And perhaps James felt bad because after Trollope was lying 6 feet under the earth in Kensal Rise Cemetery, he wrote, Trollope's great and inestimable merit was the complete appreciation of the usual. He felt all daily and immediate things as well as he saw them. He felt them in a simple, direct way with their sadness, their gladness, their charm, their comicality, and all of their obvious and measurable meanings. Trollope will remain of the writers who have helped the heart of man to know himself. So, I think, how are we doing on time? I've spoken for an hour. Sorry. Does anyone have any questions? Can I throw open the floor? Would anyone like? Hello. How are you doing?
Hello, lovely talk.
Thank you.
Enjoyed that. Well, I've got this image of tromping around the streets. I remember those times the police would do some crazy stuff. Were you ever stopped and sort of, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Now, it was interesting because one of the okay. So the question was, whilst I was going around the streets during lockdown, was there ever stopped and challenged as to what I was doing? And the answer is simply yes. And often I would go and approach, if I saw police officers, I would go and approach them and say, what are you up to? How's it going? What are you doing? And then they say, oh, well, why do you want to know? And I'd show them my press card and they'd zip up immediately. Or I wouldn't show them my press card and I'd say, oh, well, you know, I'm doing food deliveries. I haven't got my T-shirt. I had a T-shirt which said food bank on it. So yes, it was easy enough. But it was very, very strange. It was like the start of 28 Days Later, that zombie film. It was so weird. It was so strange being able to pull up anywhere, not sitting in any traffic jams, but also, you know, the buildings felt quite mournful. Like, I can't believe I could say that. I walked down Oxford Street and I missed people. I missed the chuggers. I missed you lot. It was a very strange experience. But the one thing which I really did enjoy was I got to see the architectural detail on our amazing buildings much better because there was no one pushing past me or something. So it was like being on holiday in a way. I know that sounds terrible because we're coming to something serious, but it was like rediscovering a place that I knew really well, seeing it through different eyes. Anyone else like to? I'd love to hear from you all about my newspaper because I know that the History Society and my paper they're quite interlinked. So if any of you want to criticise what the CNJ does or ask us about anything we do or anything we should cover, the floor is yours as well. It doesn't have to be about, you know, my book or local history. So, you know, and if you don't say, I could go back to my colleagues and say, do you know what? They all love our paper. No criticisms at all. Hello.
I do like the paper, and
thank you.
But sometimes I wonder who does read it, because I was elected as a local councillor last year, and I think we all read and write in the local paper. simply to see what everybody else who are our opponents
Yeah,
and the opposition are doing and saying. But it's incredible that CNJ has continued through all these difficult periods, and there are very few local papers, and that really is so damaging for local democracy, because we try and deliver stuff and information, and half the place is locked up. You can't get into buildings, you
yeah.
can't get into gated communities. But the CNJ has survived and is so good for local democracy.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So that was really a question about what the CNJ's role, I suppose, is, and how we make sure that we're relevant to our readership, how people read it still. A couple of observations. The CNJ floats on a stormy sea, which we can't really control. You know, how do we get our news today? What media do you use? Online? How has the nature of what we consume changed beyond all recognition? And in many ways, the CNJ still uses a 1970s print business model. Now, why do we do that? Okay, firstly, we're very fortunate that we don't have shareholders. There's no one squeezing a profit out of my work. A little bit of background: the CNJ was formed from, it used to be a paper called the Camden Journal, and in 1982, the reporters went on strike over an argument with the owners, a group called the North London Newspaper Group, partly because they were trying to asset strip the paper. They went on strike for 2 years. They produced renegade CNJ over those 2 years. Our lovely readers used to come and collect it on a Friday and walk around the pubs of Camden Town and sell it. Do you remember the actor Denham Elliott? Denham Elliott used to go and deliver the new journal for us to say thank you, and he always knew people would buy him a pint, and he liked a beer. So he'd go on a pub crawl with CNJs under his arm and come back rolling with a pocket full of shrapnel for us. So it was formed once the industrial dispute was finished. The owners said, look, we don't really want to have this newspaper anymore. So they sold it to my colleagues for £1. And that's why it says Camden New Journal, to differentiate it. So we don't have shareholders. We don't have anyone to pay except ourselves. So our overheads are quite low, which is one of the reasons we've managed to stay afloat for so long. And also, we're very fortunate. We've got a brilliant demographic. We're, of all the places to run a local paper, it's the centre of the world. It's fantastic. We quite campaigning, so we like to be a voice for the voiceless, but also there are two elements that I think are really important. The newspaper has always been free, well, since it's been the New Journal, and that was a decision not taken on business grounds. It was before free newspapers existed, really. It was because we wanted it to be read by as many people as possible, because that's what local democracy is about: informing people, making sure they're empowered. And the reason we haven't changed that now is you be surprised at the IT deficit still in this borough. There are people who do not have access to a computer. There's still people who do not have a smartphone. And are we going to say to them, oh, well, you're not important, you can only read my newspaper online. Oh, you can only do it for using an app? Of course we're not. So having a print edition is really, really important for a large number of our readers who really are loyal, and what we write about matters to them. And there's one other reason for that. I like reading the paper in the bath. That's why I buy a Sunday paper. It's my way of relaxing. So yes, sorry.
One of our online listeners has asked, where is the paper printed and can groups go see this happening?
Oh, right. Well, we're printed in a big print firm up in Watford. And yes, you're more than welcome to come up with us one day. What we could do is we could take you from incredibly Dickensian. It's very romantic. And when we send our pages up to a printers in Watford, and then we have a team of our own distribution guys. We don't get it distributed by a big company like the Standard would or any of the other news groups. We actually employ our own distribution guys, so we know that they're being paid a fair wage. We have a rule that the person who earns the most of the journal can only earn 3 times the amount of the person who earns the least. So we have a 3-in-1 rule. So the editorial boys. They're not so much 13-year-olds like myself. They generally tend to be pensioners. People look seriously. We employ a team of older people who deliver our paper for us because it keeps them fit and we pay really good wages and it's part-time and it's fun. But in answer to that, yes, you
Great.
contact me at the paper and I'll make that happen.
And Mark Aston says, hi, Dan.
Hello, Mark.
Really enjoyed your talk. One aspect of the CNJ and its sister paper, the Islington Tribune, is their letters page, vital for gauging past and present local comment. You must get many sent in each week. How do you decide what and who gets published?
That's a great question, Mark. Mark, if it's Mark Aston, I think it is. He wrote this wonderful book about the cinemas of Camden. Yeah. Hello, Mark. Thank you very much for your work. Love it, mate. Okay, so yeah, one of our strong points is our letters page. And if we had frankly, if we had the money, because every page costs us quite a lot to print. So if we could get the advertising, we could print 5 times the amount of letters we print. We still manage to do a good 5 pages a week, which is unheard of. There's not another local paper in the country which gets anywhere near that. There's, even the Guardian or the national papers print what is essentially half a page when you put the leader and all the page furniture around it. We get lots and lots of letters. We get far too many to print, but we try to reply to most of them. We use them to set us off in stories. How we decide what we're going to print, it's a mixture of stuff. Really practical things is, when does it arrive on my desk? Is it before 2 p.m. on a Tuesday? If so, you've got a better chance of getting in. That's how it works, because we have to have the pages done. So practical reason, but also we try to look at what is exercising our readers. It can be anything from a hyperlocal issue, which is really important to me. People say, oh, why are you working on the national? That's where all the big stories are. Much parish style news, because that's a microcosm of the human condition, as stories which you think would have an international relevance. In fact, you'll find that the parish news style of stories we run have as much relevance to people around the world as the big breaking stories, because they're all about what intrinsically means to be a human being. So we get lots and lots of letters. We do try to reply to as many. We look for letters that make important points. We look for letters that are concise, but we also look for letters that make us smile. It's so important that a newspaper tickles you as well as informs you. It should be a form of entertainment too. It should make you smile and love your community. And I think our letters page does that really well. Something I'm probably most proud of. I love our letters page. And we're looking at our post bag on a Monday morning. It's a joy. I mean, it's extremely funny. We get an awful lot of letters written in green ink and capital letters, which aren't signed, which we can't publish. But even them, they're a hoot. They're great to know. Anyway, any more? Anyone else?
Mark says, brilliant, thanks, Dan.
Nice one, Mark.
And he'll remember the Tuesday deadline.
Thank you. Yes, Tuesday, 2 p.m.
Well, I must admit, what can I say after that? No wonder the Camden New Journal and your book is so incredible. My wife has got used to me, when I come into London, diverting to find out what to pick up a paper copy. But for those outside London, and I live in Watford where it's printed, it's available online.
That's right.
You do it on Friday, Friday.
By Friday, we've managed to get around to.
And so, it's addictive. And I must admit, the book, when I picked it up, I did devour. Reminded me of some of the places it made me think, well, the time my wife used to work in the Foreign Office, one of my favourite parks was St James's Park. If you haven't been there recently, it is so fantastic there. Sadness about things that have gone, like the Chippenham Hotel being a bit wrecked inside. Yeah. But I learned for the first time where the mountains at the foot of Centre Point had gone to.
Oh, right, yeah, that's right.
So
yeah.
It's good. And copies are available here. If you don't get them today, they will be available in the centre for a very long time. Dan, what can I say? It really was an excellent tour. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure to be here.